what is the status quo in many parts of the world? What is one tangible example we can focus on? And I pick Egypt because I live there for part of each year. And so I have family and friends there. I have property there. And so Egypt's a market that I follow a little bit more closely than any other developing market. And this chart here shows Egypt's inflation rate over the past 60 plus years. And as you can see, they spent about as much time in double-digit inflation as they have not been in double-digit inflation. And they're by no means the worst example of this. During this chart period, there were literally dozens of countries that hyperinflated or had triple-digit inflation and therefore roughly hyperinflated, or had just nonlinear currency resets. And so the fact that they actually managed to have under 50% inflation the whole time puts them not anywhere near the worst camp. And you can imagine living and working in this environment for this long. You're on a constant treadmill. Your wages, your savings, you're on a constant treadmill. If you're not getting a 10, 15, 20% nominal raise every year, you're getting devalued. Like your share of the network is diminishing. And then even if you are, your global purchasing power is very hard to keep up. Your ability to import things, your ability to fly around the world, travel to other places. And so everybody's on this constant treadmill. And when you talk to people there, there's this really interesting thing is that you're almost like in two worlds at once. You're in 2024, and yet I know, for example, the anecdote I like to point out is I know a physician there, and he stacks physical cash dollars that he buys in the gray market and stuffs them under his mattress or the equivalent, and that's his savings technology for liquid savings in 2024. And he's not alone in that. And he's actually lucky because he actually he's in Cairo. He has access to cash gray market dollars. Many people don't. They're saving in Egyptian pounds. Many of them are unbanked, and they're just getting constantly diluted. And when you zoom out, there's 160 different currencies in the world, and many of them operate similarly to how we kind of think of arcade tokens or casino chips. So, for example, this is an Egyptian pound. There's very little I could do with this in New Jersey. All the moneyness of this is basically void outside of Egypt. There's nobody that wants this. It's very hard to get this off my hands. It'd be easier to get a gold coin or a Bitcoin off my hands for something than this. Similar to how a casino chip or an arcade token mainly just has value in or near the issuer and lacks significant salability outside of that kind of enforced jurisdiction. And there's dozens and dozens and dozens of countries like this. And you can imagine, so in Africa, there are something like 40 currencies. And in Latin America, there's something like 30 currencies. And you can imagine in the United States, if every state had its own currency, the frictions that this would cause. So if anybody came to this talk from New York and they brought their New York dollars, they'd have to figure out what to do with the New York dollars. They want to go buy something in Jersey here. Or if they're a business and they're getting financing and they're raising New York dollars for their liabilities, and their cash flows are denominated in New Jersey dollars that might fluctuate significantly compared to the debt they just took out. And every sort of conversion point comes with major fees. That's a reality that well over 1 billion people in the world, probably multiple billions in the world, face on an ongoing basis. And when we look at the domestic situation, it's not nearly as extreme as a developing market currency. But we have our own structural imbalances and questions when we look out into the future. So these charts just show the 50 plus years of U.S. structural trade deficits in blue and decades of rising public debt to GDP in purple and projections. This is from the Congressional Budget Office for how things are likely going to be in the future. And in this system that we have, we think of it as a pretty steady state system. Right. So in engineering terms, we think of a system as either stable or marginally stable or unstable. And when we think of a money system, especially those of us that live in North America or Europe or Japan, you think of your system as pretty stable. But underneath the surface, there are these imbalances building up significantly. And the same thing happened under the prior era of the system. So, for example, during the Bretton Woods era, you had a gold peg for multiple decades. But underneath the surface, the number of dollars tripled, and the amount of gold reserves backing up those dollars kept reducing. So underneath the surface, you were having this growing instability that kind of guaranteed that the system would not last indefinitely, and yet it seemed normal until it wasn't normal anymore. And so in some ways, I think that many countries find themselves in a similar place now where things seem fairly stable. We can't imagine things significantly happening in the near term. But when you project these things out 20, 30, 40, 50 years, no one really has a great answer of what's going to happen. The Federal Reserve Chairman was just on 60 Minutes this past week, and he was asked about fiscal sustainability. And he said, it's a major long-term issue that it's a very difficult issue to work through. And so I bring up these examples just to show that where we are now has a lot of unsustainable aspects to it, whether or not you're in Egypt or dozens of other countries like it, facing the constant daily grind of very high inflation, currency debasement, bank freezes, things like that, or these more benign but long-term unsustainability questions here in developed markets around our money system. When we back up a second and think where we got to this point, when I look at the history of money, I separate two major categories. So one is physical money itself, and how technology changes what we use as physical money. So in a hunter-gatherer context, shell beads, for example, were very popular types of money. In Neolithic cultures, things like grains or things like small silver coins were very popular money. And when technology gets to a point, it starts to obsolete older forms of money. So for example, metal tooling and advanced fishing techniques and doing things at scale can severely devalue the usefulness of shells as money, for example. Things that used to be scarce in a certain technological environment suddenly become a lot less scarce in a more industrial environment. And in many ways, the history of physical money is kind of going up the stack in terms of finding the next scarcest thing, figuring out how to make more of it, going up to the next scarcest thing until we kind of settle on gold as a thing that we, even to today, we can't rapidly increase the supply of. And so that's kind of one path that money emerged in. The other one was how to make it more efficient. So I have on here transactions and settlements. Banking and bank-like entities have existed for thousands of years. And the two main roles, one was the provision of credit. That's been known for thousands of years. If you look at the Code of Hammurabi in Babylon, for example, there's rules about lending and things like that 4,000 years ago. But the other key thing that I think doesn't get enough attention is the physical movement, verification, and divisibility of other types of money. So for hundreds of years and stretching back thousands of years, not only did people want credit, they wanted to have efficient ways to transfer money over long distances from one city to another city. And if they're doing that on a regular basis, maybe they don't want a caravan of metals with them every time. It's got safety issues, it's got verification issues, it's expensive. And so over time, there emerged a number of technologies that simplified and made easier transactions. So I have here a bunch of analog examples are coinage, paper, bookbinding of paper, the printing press, and analog encryption. And an example that I refer to in the book quite heavily is the Hawala system. And that was the system that predated, when we think of banking, we often think of Italian city-state banking in the Renaissance, but prior to that system, there were a number of proto-banking arrangements. And the Hawala system along the Silk Road was one of the more widespread systems. And in that type of system, and this is just an example that can be applied in multiple regions, if you wanted to transfer money from one city to another city, you could go to your local money changer, your local hawaladar, give them gold, and they would give you a paper receipt or a messenger with a paper receipt. And this requires a number of technologies. They have to have a communication with another money changer in another city. They have to have ways to make sure that the paper can't be forged or copied in some way. And then you take this analog encrypted paper instrument, you bring it to another city, and you go to a hawaladar or money changer in the network, and you can redeem gold in this other network. And those money changers can, net transactions between each other and settle rarely under more secure conditions, while the transaction value can move very quickly. That's an early example of trying to solve some of the frictions of money. And then, of course, as we invented, digital technologies, so the bottom list there is telegraph, telephone, internet, digital encryption, and blockchains, we dialed everything up a notch. The telegraph, I often like to say, is the most important monetary technology that rarely gets talked about, because it's the first thing that separated greatly transaction speeds from settlement speeds. Prior to the telegraph, anytime you wanted to transmit information long distances, especially high bandwidth information, you had to physically go there. even if you were recording things with ledgers and things like that, someone had to physically move the ledger to this other location. Information couldn't travel faster than foot, horses, and ships. But in the 1830s, when they invented the telegraph, and then really not until the 1860s when they widely deployed it across continents and across the Atlantic Ocean, you had this arrangement where you could send information part of the way across the world, even though the physical settlement of money, of gold at the time, still was expensive and slow. And so you created this larger and larger gap between transaction speeds and settlement speeds. And so that's kind of the history of where we got to this day. And one kind of, I often say that in broken money, the single most kind of interesting source to me was this chart. And this is actually, it's 4 different charts that I put together from the same book. This is a chart from 1875. And if I were to summarize the history of finance, it's this chart, which is essentially that every single time you run into a friction with money, the solution has been to centralize some aspect of it, trust an intermediary, and then solve that friction. And so, for example, the top chart there shows a bunch of different entities using the same bank. And if you all use the same bank and you want to send money back and forth between each other, you don't have to actually change physical money. You can just tell the bank, deduct my credits, give them credits, and it's hyper efficient. The second chart there shows what happens if you want to send money to someone at a different bank. Well, those banks have to have a way to communicate with each other. And so I could tell my bank not only to deduct my credits, but then also you settle with the other bank and give them credits in their account. But then you have questions like, well, how do banks quickly settle with each other? In the old days, they could literally settle with each other with armed guard. They send gold or banknotes to each other under secure conditions. And over time, with various liquidity crises or just general efficiency centralization tendencies, they realized that banks can treat each other in a similar way that we treat banks. They can all have an account at a central bank, and settling with each other could be as simple as telling that central bank, deduct credits from me and give credits to them. And so you have this more and more chain of centralization. And in William Stanley Jevons' time, when he wrote about this in 1875, this was the dawn of the telegraph era. It was about less than a decade after the cross-Atlantic telegraph cable. And his book was actually kind of the similar version of my book, just 150 years prior. He's talking about the technology of money. It was called Money and the Mechanism of Exchange. And he's going into the historical path of money, the gritty details of how coinage works, and the things about it you don't think about, and problems that arise with coinage. And then he's talking about all these modern banking arrangements and centralization. And on one hand, he's pointing out how hyper efficient this is. He's like marveling that this is so efficient. Gold rarely ever has to change hands. You're just constantly trading ownership for it. On the other hand, he's like, this is extremely centralizing, and it's so hyper efficient that it's become hyper leveraged. That he's like looking around in 1875 and saying this is levered 20 to 1. If 5% of people ever want their gold back at once, which never seems to happen because gold's so inefficient, but if it were to happen, the system is technically it's insolvent. It's very illiquid relative to the leverage that built up. And of course, we all know decades later in World War I, it did all in fact break. And so we've had centuries, arguably thousands of years, but especially centuries, where every friction was solved by centralization, even at the international scale. So the bottom chart there is if you have central banks in different countries, you have the question of how do they settle with each other? In the old days, you could send gold to each other, but that's hyper inefficient. And so instead they rely on another ledger, which in Jevons' time was basically the United Kingdom. So he was talking about how, various centralized banking entities around the world could all kind of get together in London and have a major clearinghouse to hyper efficiently trade everything. And of course, now that gravitated over to the United States and New York. Basically, whatever central bank is the biggest one kind of serves as the foundational ledger, not quite in the literal sense of the other ones, but serves as part of the foundational ledger that ties all the other ledgers together in the global sense. We just have, centralization built on centralization built on centralization. That's the best we could do for a long time. And what I find so interesting ever since 2009 is that for the first time, we have a pretty credible way to decentralize some of this. And so, with Bitcoin, for example, it's, there's a lot of noise in the media about crypto projects breaking and, gambling and, currencies go up dramatically and then get leverage built on them and fall apart. And it's a really distracting industry in many ways. But the underlying thing that's happening there is something that I think is unfortunately not getting the attention that it probably deserves because of all those issues. And so really what Bitcoin represents is a ledger that is decentralized. And so it's the first time, arguably, where you get greater efficiency in many aspects, but it does not come at the cost of greater centralization. So we spent centuries going through this tree, building up more and more layers of centralization to solve more and more problems, and sometimes creating their own problems along the way. And now we have interesting technologies that give more of an option to potentially reverse some of that. So it's not just one technology, it's potentially a whole reversal or a whole another avenue to explore after centuries of centralization. And, it's not just Bitcoin itself, it's also things like stablecoins, for example. So we can think of when we are choosing who to trust, sometimes trust is imposed upon us. So the reason I brought up Egypt as an example, Egypt's a country of 100 million people, and most people there never chose to trust the Egyptian central bank with their savings or what they're denominating their wages in. Just by happenstance of where they're born, this is the entity that has a pretty significant monopoly over them money-wise, which is arguably the most powerful monopoly you could have. The monopoly of what everyone's denominating their unit in, what their debt's denominated in, what their savings are denominated in, and then even using banking rails to send money to each other in many contexts. Whoever can control that controls quite a bit. And it could be a benign controller in some cases, or it could be a more malevolent controller, or it could be an incompetent controller in other cases. There's 160 currencies out there. And what Bitcoin does is it says, okay, here's this other ledger. It's based on code and rules instead of human decision making. But then even beyond that, there's things like stablecoins that say, well, it's centralized, but the central hub is outside of your country. And you now have more tools to decide who in the world you want to trust with money or assets. And so it's kind of a funny chart or a funny image that I put together here, but it tries to illustrate the point that I don't see discussed enough, which is that a really big thing that things like Bitcoin and stablecoins do, and kind of the broader idea of decentralizing ledgers, is that it opens up these silos. So we exist in a world, there's 160 plus different currencies. Many of them are free floating, other ones are pegged. Currency pegs break all the time. So basically they're all these isolated environments, and they are a product of those decades and centuries of centralization. That's the best way we've known so far how to make transactions efficient, is going through centralized intermediaries. But that trust is broken all the time. Dozens of hyperinflated currencies within our lifetime, other ones with double-digit, triple-digit inflation. I have friends over at the Human Rights Foundation. They work on combating authoritarianism worldwide. And they see that many people have bank accounts frozen for arbitrary reasons. Someone in Nigeria protests police violence and excessive use of police force, and then their bank accounts are frozen. So they have to turn to Bitcoin or stable coins to get donations and try to go around their local banking system. And when you think of how a currency monopoly enforces itself, there's really only two major ways to get money in or out of a given currency monopoly. One of them is through bank wires, right? So if I wire money to someone in Egypt, for example, I can send money to them. The challenge, of course, is that the Egyptian banking system has very tight control over what types of money they let in, what exchange rate they convert it to the local currency before the recipient gets it, whether or not they allow people in their country to get dollar accounts, how safe those dollar accounts are, because then you have potentially fractional reserve dollar accounts with no tie to the Federal Reserve, for example. And so that can be a very restricted portal. And the other method, of course, on the bottom there is port of entry. You can physically bring money with you. You can bring cash, you can bring gold through an airport, but anyone who goes through airports regularly knows it's all these signs saying, if you're over $5,000 or over $10,000 worth of things, you've got to declare it and potentially can't get it in. Which, in the United States, we might not think of as a big deal, but if you're trying to protect your wealth, if you're trying to move wealth from one problematic jurisdiction to another, or choosing who to trust as your money ledger, those are historically have been burdens in how those monopolies are enforced. And what's interesting about this technology that I think is just starting to really catch on. So Bitcoin's been around for 15 years, But the first 10 years, it was so small that the liquidity and the size was not really significant on a macro scale. And stablecoins are even newer. I think the first one came out in 2014. And even as late as 2018, 2019, you're talking a few $billions of total stablecoin market cap. And fast forward over this past cycle, now stablecoins are worth over $100 billion in market capitalization and still having an upward trajectory. They're one of the things that held up better in this bear market in the industry because they're actually, in many cases, providing utility to people. And so despite the fact that these technologies are pretty old at this point, the liquidity is just kind of reaching critical mass where it's getting very interesting for many jurisdictions. And the main thing that they do that I show there on the chart on the right is they get around these currency silos. So 160 different currency monopolies, some good, some middling, some bad, unfortunately many bad. And what this does is it allows locals to go around their local banking system. So for example, if I wanted to pay a graphic designer in Nigeria, instead of sending money to her that goes then through wires and might even not get to her in her currency at the exchange rate that their central bank decides, she can hold up a QR code on a video call and ask for payment in dollar stable coins or Bitcoin or whatever type of money she wants, and I can send it to her, and it goes around her local banking system, and it can go cross-border. So the frictions of 140 different currencies in Africa or 30 different currencies in Latin America can become diminished over time because this is all going around their cluster of centralized banking systems. Something as simple as an email or a DM can give someone a payment string that they can receive value on. And of course, as an American, I'm happy to help them go around their local system if it means getting them paid in a currency that's useful to them, that they can save, that they can have autonomy over. The only time I would have an issue is if it's a country that I'm sanctioned from sending money to. So Venezuela or Iran, I wouldn't put myself at risk, even though I'd have the technical capability to do so. I obviously wouldn't. Whereas for the vast majority of countries, the problem emanates from their side. And technology lets them go around their local problem, and then I'm happy to work with them. The other method, of course, is port of entry. And what things like Bitcoin or stablecoins do is technically you now have infinite value density going through any sort of port of entry. So you can memorize 12 words representing your private key, and you can bring $10 million, $100 million of value through an airport. And there's really no way to prove a negative or prove that that's not happening. And so currency brokers can get money in or out of regions at significant densities that not existed before. And so, we tend to think of the world as a static place, that, we have a past and now we have a present, and this is how things are now. But I think that this is an era that's going to be heavily disrupted in a similar way that prior eras were. And basically, I think over the next several decades, we're going to see a breakdown of a lot of these currency monopolies. And it's going to be disruptive, and it's going to be politically tumultuous. But that when we get to the other side of that, there's a lot of promise there. That, it's most people would argue that people having choices for what they use as money, and if they're stuck in a jurisdiction that does not provide that to them, that it's ethical that they should seek it, and it makes sense that they would seek it. And so basically, I would invite people to explore this technology, not to dismiss it, despite the fact that the industry as a whole has been very problematic. But when you strip away a lot of the bad incentives that are overlaid on top of it, some of the core underlying use cases are impactful. And so I'm happy to discuss, I'm happy to do Q&A, and thank you for listening.